Are you thinking about which college you should attend? Well, you've probably considered things like cost, location, and programs. Maybe you've even watched the other video I did on that, and hopefully you have. But let's talk about some things that maybe you haven't thought about that you should be when it comes time to pick a college. Let's talk about 6 lesser known things that you should be considering when you make your college decision. Number 1 is name recognition. This may or may not go on your list. I don't know how you feel about this, but for me, this is something I feel like should carry some weight. Name recognition. Let's talk about like this. Some schools, maybe they're a household name, like we'll say Harvard, for instance. Some universities, maybe their name carries a lot of weight in the region in which they're located. You may find some schools even have kind of a bad rap. Now, some of that is subjective, and some of that might be in the eye of the beholder, but the litmus test that you should use at the end of the day, how will you feel about that name on that diploma hanging on your wall? If you're spending a lot of money, a lot of dollars, investing a lot of time, money, toil, blood, sweat, and tears in that degree, you want to make sure you feel good about the degree that is hanging on your wall at the end of the day. The second thing you want to think about is accreditation. And accreditation is a big fancy word, and there's a lot of things that can go into it. One of the jobs I had previously, I worked with accreditation things a little bit, and expect a video on accreditation before too long. I want to talk about that. I don't know if that video will be a hoot and a half, but I want it to be insightful and hopefully shed a little bit of light on what is accreditation. But you want to look for a school that is what we call regionally accredited. That's the best type of accreditation to have, regional accreditation. And off the top of my head, I forget how many regional accrediting bodies. There's a handful of them in the U.S. that accredit schools. There's another type of accreditation, national accreditation, which actually kind of sounds better, but believe it or not, regional accreditation is actually better than having national accreditation. So look for a school that has some sort of regional accreditation. When you go to a university's webpage, you should be able to find that information very readily. You want to think about number 3, the campus political climate. Now, some universities, in fact, probably more universities than not, probably lean a little bit to the left politically, but of course, not all universities do. I actually attended a private Christian university, which I would say definitely leaned right, and in some ways definitely was more to the right than where I found myself. So you want to think about what is the political climate on this campus. You want to think about where you feel about that as well. Now, just because you may not totally line up with the campus, that doesn't mean you shouldn't go there. And in fact, it's not even necessarily a bad thing. But for instance, if you find yourself maybe a little bit more on the conservative side and you're going to a very liberal campus, I expect to be surrounded by people who don't share your point of view. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's kind of a situation of, don't act like no one told you, because it's definitely going to happen. But even if you find yourself in that position, perhaps you're a more conservative student on a liberal campus, or maybe a more liberal student on a conservative campus, because I have seen that happen. Regardless, there should be some kind of a campus organization for students who share your points of view and belief. So it's not necessarily like you'll be isolated either, but this is something that you want to think about, and something you want to think about and take into account. Number 4, campus rules. Now, most of the time, state schools, public institutions are going to be at least pretty relaxed on rules for the most part. Now, when you go to a private school like I did my last 2 years, what you sign up for when you voluntarily go to a private school is you voluntarily submit to rules typically. Now, what are those rules going to be? It depends on the type of university. If it's not affiliated with something perhaps like religious or otherwise, it may not be all that strict. But especially if you go to a school with some kind of religious ties, you may go to a school that even restricts things like sexual activity, alcohol consumption, tobacco consumption, maybe other substances. You may be subject to curfews and things like that. And how do you feel about that? Okay, and again, there's really no right or wrong answer, but these are things you want to think about. Now, I'll tell you, when I went away to like I said, a more conservative private school, I mean, we knew the rules up front, and people consistently complained about the rules, and yeah, they could be a little bit much at times, but on the other hand, it's not like anyone didn't know that when they came there either. So you want to think about that. Can I voluntarily submit to rules? Do I voluntarily want to submit to rules, or do I want to have as much freedom as possible? And again, I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer. You just have to decide what's most important to you and how you feel about that. Number 5, you want to think about the quality of instruction, and this could mean a few different things. Some schools, I would say, just it's probably not wrong to say just have more prestigious faculty than other schools. Some universities might be more like a starter school. You might get people who are launching their careers, maybe, dare I say it, even people who maybe aren't as competitive in their fields, and that's generalization. It may not be true all of the time. Even as I went to a community college for a while, and there are probably a few people that fall into the category I just described, but there are some people who are pretty world class there too. So don't think that just because you go to a community college or you're not maybe at like one of the schools, my pennant collection here behind me, that you're going to get subpar instruction, because that's not necessarily true. But you do want to think about what caliber of faculty, and you can go on a website and you can investigate these people, particularly ones in your intended subject that you want to study. See where they get their faculty. All right, but also you want to be thinking about things like a really large school might use teaching assistants, TAs, and a lot of times these are graduate students, possibly PhD students, but in some cases they may only be a couple years older than you and working on a graduate degree. That person might be teaching your class, and if that sounds like, oh, that's a mixed bag, you might get someone really good or really lousy, you're exactly right. That's exactly what might happen. You might get someone who's incredible, and you might get someone who's simply there for a tuition waiver and really doesn't even care about teaching the class. So if you go to a school that has that uses a lot of TAs, especially for a general education class, it might be something to think about. And also bigger schools, you tend to run into bigger class sizes as well, just as a side note. So you may want to think about that. Do I see myself sitting in a room full of 300 people? Would you want to do that even? Number 6, you want to think about the overall safety of the institution. Now, schools have a document they must complete called an annual security report, and I've done these before, and you have to list every crime that takes place on, and in some cases, near campus. And what I would recommend doing is looking up some crime statistics for the campus and seeing if that's a place, is that a place where you would feel safe? Would you feel secure being there? And you want to think about statistics too, like for instance, 1 in 5 women and 1 in 20 men experience at least an attempted sexual assault during college. And you heard me right, 1 in 5 women and up to 1 in 20 men experience at least an attempted sexual assault during college. Those are kind of disheartening statistics, but it's just part of the world we live in, unfortunately. But the campus that you're looking at do they have a good campus police presence? Is that a place where you would feel safe? These are questions you want to ask yourself. Not just the campus also, but even if the campus looks good, if it's located in maybe a city that's less than safe, that's another great question to ask yourself. So again, these are some things that maybe you haven't thought about when it comes time to think about that college decision, maybe things that haven't been at the forefront of your mind, but these are also things you probably really ought to be thinking about to help ensure that you're making the best decision, that you don't go somewhere for a semester or for a year and regret your decision and have to go back to the drawing board. You can always transfer schools, and again, expect a video on that. That is an upcoming topic of mine, good and bad reasons for transferring schools, so stay tuned for that if you want to hear more about that. But anytime you can stay put, generally or at least a lot of the time, it tends to work out if you can do that. So hopefully this has given you some things to think about. Also, hopefully you've been enjoying this content. If you have enjoyed my series of videos, please consider liking this video. Please share and subscribe. What I want to do is I want to get this content in the hands of as many students who need it as possible, so please help me out with that. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope to see you soon.